What if I told you that you could take your footage that looked like this and make it look more like this, all with using free tools already in DaVinci Resolve Studio? Hey everybody, hope 2024 is going great. If you've been making any sort of content on YouTube, you've no doubt heard the words, make it look cinematic. Well, what exactly does that mean anyway? One thing that people often associate cinematic with is the look and feel of analog film. And it's become quite trendy as of late to emulate the film characteristics with digital footage. I hesitate to call what I'm about to show you a tutorial because that implies I know what I'm doing. In effect, I've watched countless tutorials and over the years have developed my own method that works for me. But much like a chili cook-off, this will be quite subjective and everybody will have their own particular spin or flavor on how they achieve the look that they're after. So by no means is this meant to be a definitive explanation on how best to do this. This is just the method that I've been using in my particular workflow, and perhaps you may find it helpful. So without further ado, let's jump into DaVinci Resolve. And before we get into the film emulation part of this, I wanted to show you just a generic clip first that will then go through the workflow of emulating film. And just for the sake of example, I call this my control clip. And you can see that what we've done here is just convert it from the red color space to a Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. Why this is going to be important here, as we jump into the film emulation template node graph, I want to draw your attention to one particular node. If I can turn all this off here. And that will be this check node. So you can see what I'm doing here to start off this film emulation is I like to have a check node. And what I'm basically doing here is emulating or replicating this exact look, right? I find that before doing any sort of film emulation or even color grading for that matter, it's often best to start with a very well-balanced image. In my experience, trying to color grade something without balancing it first really yields a lousy result, and oftentimes mistakes get worse and worse as you get further down the node tree unless you've balanced the image very early in the pipeline. So the first thing that I do before doing any sort of film emulation is getting a very well-balanced image first. Lots of ways to do this. I won't cover that here. In my particular workflow, I'm using a lot of the red controls because I am working with a raw image. This gives me ultimate latitude and flexibility for things like ISO and color temperature and tint and so forth. So before I go any further, I always check the image to make sure that I'm starting with a very well-balanced image first. Then what I will do is turn off this check node and turn on these last two nodes. The first of the two is converting the color space transform that we started with, right? So just to kind of walk you through it, I'm going from the red color space, changing it to DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate. Then what I'm doing in the second to last node is taking that DaVinci Intermediate and now converting it into a Rec 709. But the important thing here to note is that the output gamma is now going to be Cine on film log. More on this in just a second. So once we've done that, then we have a workflow that has one final node in this tree here. And this is the one that's going to be expecting a film LUT. And for those that aren't aware, DaVinci Resolve has built-in film emulation LUTs within the software. Now, the important thing to note here is that if you're going to use any of these, be certain to use ones that start with Rec 709. You can see here in this example, this is a DCI P3, etc. You're going to be looking for ones that say Rec 709. Why? Because we've told Resolve that the output color space is Rec 709, and that the gamma is a Cine on film log, which means it's designed to work with these film LUTs because this LUT is expecting to ingest or take in a Rec 709 Cine on film log to do its proper thing. So we'll turn on this LUT, and you can see in this case, I've added the 2383 D65 LUT. So this gives us a very basic film emulation. Just to recap here, we're going from the red color space, and we're converting it to a DaVinci Wide Gamut. And then at the end of the node tree, we're going from DaVinci Wide Gamut to a Cineon. And then from there, the final LUT is effectively putting the cherry on the sundae and giving us one of several options within Resolve to give us the film look that we're after. Again, for the sake of this example, the 2383 D55. Now from here, what I like to do, now that I have a basic idea of how the image is gonna look, I like to go in one by one and play around with different things. So the way that I've broken down this node tree by no means is the ultimate way to do it. It's just the way that I've found works quite well. I break my node tree into primary adjustments, secondary adjustments, and then color adjustments. So primary for me would be more of a contrast curve type of thing, right? So here's an example of what I did in this clip, and then a secondary may be a fine tuning of what I just did or playing around just to get a bit more of a granular adjustment, how I like it. And then color could be any number of things. In this case, there's nothing going on. But I like to leave it there in my node tree because oftentimes I will go in and adjust things, maybe using a hue versus hue or a hue versus sat. And this gives me a specific node to make those corrections and keep everything nice and tidy. So from here, my image is adjusted. I've made my basic primary and secondary adjustments. I no longer need the check node because I've already checked that the image is balanced. And again, now we get to play around with these nodes, which in my mind is where the process starts to get fun. You can't have film emulation without playing around with something like halation. And for those that aren't aware, the halation option is just it's OFX. You can find that in your library, and you can just do a search for it. Type in halation, you'll see it there, and then you can simply drag it onto a node. So I've done that here, and you can see I have various settings, and it's incredibly powerful, right? The Resolve tool built in is insanely powerful. So I have some basic settings that I like to do there. You can see kind of the before and after if we zoom in here. And for those that aren't aware, halation really harkens back to the physical characteristics of film and the way that light passes through emulsion. And RGB, right, red, green, and blue, in actual analog film, they have a very specific order, and red happens to be the very last color in that process, so that when light is passing through the various layers of emulsion and it reaches the red emulsion, it had a very tough time passing all the way through it. So what would happen in the physical photochemical characteristics of film is that the red would trap a lot of the light and create sort of red halos around very bright light sources, which is where the term halation comes from, the halo. So you can see again, if I go before and after, you can see what's occurring. Again, so many settings just in this node alone that you can get in there and play with. So we're just scratching the surface here, and feel free to experiment and get it exactly how you like it. The second one that I like to play with is glow. And you can see here if I go full screen again and toggle this on or off, this is also just an OFX node. So we'll turn that on, and again, same thing as before, just go into your library and throw on this glow onto a node of your choice. And that's what we've done here. So we have halation, glow, and then lastly, not to get too geeky or inside baseball about the physical properties of film, but film, actual analog film, was known to be very gracious and very generous with highlights. So much so that it wasn't unheard of to have a situation where your image may be 3 or 4 or even 5 stops overexposed, and through the photochemical process, it was still very possible to get a usable image in your highlights. Shadows, not so much. Highlights, on the other hand, analog film was known to be very forgiving with highlights. So what I've done in my particular node template is add a specific node for highlights, and there's no specific reason you have to do it here. You could do this in your primary or secondary, etc. But I like to make a specific node as a mental note to myself that I really need to be mindful of how my highlights are looking. So you can see after doing things like halation and glow and highlights that I'm very mindful to make sure that I'm not overlooking the highlights, right? So I like to look at my image and say, okay, do the highlights feel believable? Do they feel soft? Is there a gentle roll off? In this case, you can see that I made an adjustment here using this highlight. Again, there's nothing that says you have to use this method of correcting highlights. It's super handy for me, but feel free to use the method that works for you. Lastly, what I start to do as I get towards the end of this node graph is I like to think about the physical properties of shooting on film. And I think, my humble opinion, one of the things that people often discount or forget are the lenses that you're shooting with. If you're trying to emulate film and harken back to an era where film cameras and film movies were the norm, I think it's worth thinking about what lenses might have been shot for something a bit more vintage feeling. So you can see what I like to do here is throw on a very subtle blur, and I'll go full screen with this, and I want to draw your attention to the outermost corners of the image. This is something I've been experimenting with. In this particular case, I'm using a zoom blur. Again, also in the OFX, you can just do a search like I've done and add it to a node. But I like to play around with this. I don't use it on every shot, but sometimes I find that injecting artificial, be it as it may, but injecting physical flaws into the image helps sell the illusion that the glass or the hardware used may not be so modern. So you can see a very subtle effect here. But I find that oftentimes with the other nodes that we're doing here, it gives it just a bit more believability. So again, just to wrap this up, we'll add in some grain. This could probably be a whole tutorial video all on its own. A lot of debate of where grain should live, how much grain you should use. A lot of people will tell you in their tutorials to put grain at the very beginning because real film grain was a photochemical process and it was burned in the film from the very beginning. Other people will say add it at the very end. I tend to be of the opinion that I like it somewhat in the middle end of my workflow. So you can see here I've added the grain, and this is just super fun. You can get way in the weeds here, what type of camera you want to emulate. This is all, again, in the OFX. So you can obviously replicate this, but from here, if you want something super grainy, you can go all the way up to an 8mm. And if I can give a really exaggerated feel, you can see how that's shaping up. I like to go with the 35mm myself, and I usually go with the 400T. And sometimes I like to juice up the saturation just to give it a bit more blending to the image itself, and I like to look at it just the grain only sometimes. And you can see that's kind of showing me what the grain is actually doing on top of the image. So again, super easy. I won't go into details here, but you get the idea. Lots of sliders and settings that you can sit there and experiment with and get something exactly the way that you want it. And then lastly, what I'll do is I'll throw a vignette. Numerous ways to do this also. You can go in and do a power window. I like to use the built-in effect. So you could see vignette, again, just add it, search for it in your effects library, add it to a node, pretty straightforward. And that, my friends, is how I do my particular film emulation, and I'll show you the before and the after. Again, I like oftentimes having the control clip because it gives me a really firm appreciation for the changes that I've made and just kind of how it would look out of camera and sort of what sort of character I'm injecting into the look by virtue of doing this film emulation. Have a couple more clips very quickly, go through another couple examples very fast now because you guys get the general idea. So I have my basic color space transform. I'll do a quick check. I'm liking the way that looks. I'll turn off the check, turn on everything else. And you can see the end result here. Very symbolic of film, very emblematic of it. I think you can just see the effect that it has on the reds and the greens. And this, in this particular case, I may be mindful of the color, right? Something like Going in here with my hue versus hue, maybe I want that Rolex to be a bit more true to life, so I can make that just hue versus sat, and I can get in there with my hue versus hue. Maybe make it a bit more yellow, which is how it was on set. I shouldn't say set, at the racetrack. So in this particular case, you can see where I would use this color node to make some adjustments. And then finally, this last clip here. By now, you know what each node does, so you can see, in this case, I used the color to just bring back a little bit more true to life, but same process here, right? Well, guys, as I said at the top of the intro, this is by no means a tutorial. This is really just me pulling back the curtain a bit and showing you the workflow that I've been using the last 2 to 3 years. If you think I missed something, I would actually be stoked if you left a comment down below, because I'm always willing and eager to learn from other people who have more experience than I do. With that, we'll end the video. Hope everybody's doing good, and I will see you in the next one.